Hi everyone and welcome back to the channel. My name is Jan Wegener and I've been a bird photographer for over 20 years, focusing on creating unique photos and videos and teaching others, just like you, to do the same. More and more photographers don't only want to capture photos but also beautiful videos when they're out and about in the field. And why wouldn't you? With our mirrorless cameras, we have tools right in our hands that allow us to capture high-end videos with just the press of one button. I always like to say that taking photos and videos in the field also makes you twice as successful, because sometimes you may not be able to take a great photo, but you get a nice video instead, or the other way around. Or even better, you're able to take a beautiful photo, but then also shoot a complementary video. For instance, like I did with this sacred kingfisher throwing the crabs in the air. I got a photo that is really nice, but then also getting a video that shows all the action in slow motion puts the whole experience to another level for me. I said earlier that all you need to do to capture great videos is to press one button, but that may be oversimplified because there's certain steps, settings and techniques that you have to follow in order to get those National Geographic-like looking clips. But this is exactly what I'm going to share with you today, so you can get on your way to capturing your own beautiful video clips. I'm sure you've also noticed that if you want to grow on social media, doing video is definitely something that you have to master going forward. So why not start today? Before we can actually go out in the field and capture some beautiful clips, there's a few settings that we have to make sure are dialed in correctly in our camera to be able to capture that footage and make sure that it looks great. We often hear about different frame rates like 30 frames per second, 60 frames per second, or 120 frames per second. And if you bought your camera outside the United States, you may wonder, why can't I see these on my camera body? And the reason is that your camera is very likely set to the PAL video standard instead of the NTSC video standard. In North America, you use the NTSC video standard, so your frame rates are 30, 60, 120 frames per second, whereas everywhere else you will likely have the PAL video standard, and then your frame rates are usually 25, 50, or 100 frames per second. So if you can't find the 120 frames per second on your camera, for instance, your camera is very likely set to PAL. And if you really want that 120 frames per second, you want to set it to NTSC, and then you will unlock those other frame rates. Speaking of frame rates, alongside the resolution, this is one of the first things we have to pick in our camera in order to be able to set up everything else. And I usually like to shoot in 4K. It's sort of the best compromise of video quality and file size. Some of the newer cameras will also shoot in 6K or 8K, but oftentimes then the file size becomes quite large, especially if you're shooting 8K, and your cameras also seem to overheat much quicker when shooting 8K. So I find that a little bit more limiting, and it's also much harder to deal with these humongous file sizes you're getting when you're filming in 8K. 6K can be a bit of a compromise, somewhere in between, and will allow you to crop in a little bit more when you're editing your videos, or lets you zoom in more into the files. But as my go-to, I like to shoot in 4K. Also because a lot of cameras give us oversampled 4K. That means they're taking basically an 8K picture, for instance, and then downsample it to 4K, giving us beautiful details and sharpness. So on most cameras, my go-to will be 4K as my resolution. And when it comes to the frame rate, we have to decide, do we want to capture slow motion or do we want to capture video at normal speeds? Personally, I'm a little bit tired of everything in nature photography being shown in slow motion. It can be great if the scene warrants it, like a kingfisher eating a crab, or you want to slow down a certain moment to really emphasize what's happening, like with this black swan eating the grass. In real time, basically you don't even see what's happening, whereas in slow motion you can really appreciate what is happening and how the baby swan is actually struggling, trying to swallow the grass. But at the same time, I think you should only use slow motion if the scene warrants it. For instance, you want to showcase a certain behavior or there's fast action happening that can be more appreciated when slowed down. But I wouldn't recommend using it all the time because I feel like it can become quite gimmicky. You know, those clips, dramatic music, the bird moving very slow from the left to the right. Sometimes that can be nice, but most of the time I think like it's a little bit too much, and I like seeing animals move at real speed as well. For instance, this whipbird clip, I think it's quite nice seeing the bird hob all over the log up and down and then jumping onto the other log and starting to sing. That clip in slow motion I think would actually be quite boring, whereas at full speed you can nicely appreciate how the bird is moving and also how it's singing. So I usually take my main clips in either 4K 30 or 4K 25 frames per second. And then if I know I want to capture something in slow motion, I go to 60, 120, or if available, even more frames per second. You may wonder why you can't just film everything at the high frame rate and then either slow it down or play it at the normal speed. And I wouldn't recommend that, because if you play the high speed clip at the normal speed, it looks quite chopped because you're using a too high frame rate and you're basically having too many frames in there as well. So the video just doesn't flow as nicely compared to like a proper clip filmed at like 4K and 25 frames per second. Before we talk about the all-important shutter speed settings, there's one more important thing we have to consider when setting up our camera. And that is, do we want to shoot in a standard profile, log profile, or maybe even RAW if our camera has it available. The standard profile will give you a nice contrasty file right out of the camera that only needs minimal editing, but has a much more limited dynamic range. Log profile, and there's usually different logs available on different cameras, will give you the maximum dynamic range, but at the same time also give you very flat and kind of gray, washed out looking footage. So you're getting the best possible quality with the best dynamic range, but at the same time, you're having to now edit the video files, because straight out of camera, they won't look quite right. So you have to put a LUT on, for instance, or do a lot of tweaking when it comes to editing. So shooting a log profile will give you the most dynamic range, but at the same time will require you to do some video editing. And if it's something that you don't want to do, then I would probably recommend that you shoot in the standard picture profile. Some cameras also offer us the option to shoot in RAW, and we can get beautiful, very flat looking video clips out of the camera, where we can then change everything in the editing process and get beautiful quality and good results. But at the same time, this RAW format definitely requires us to do a lot of editing, and it can also be quite straining on your computer. So if you want videos that come nicely out of the camera and don't require a lot of editing, I would recommend that you shoot in a standard profile and not in log. One thing a lot of people don't seem to know is that the picture profiles that you set in your camera's menu also affect the look of your videos if you're not filming in log. So if you're filming in a standard profile, whichever picture profile you're setting heavily influences the look of your video and also influences things like the sharpening, for instance. So normally I would gravitate towards picking a neutral color profile so my video has a little bit more dynamic range and it's not too crunchy. One thing that's very important when filming in the field is that we don't overexpose our footage, because any bit of burnt out highlights will basically be a white hole in our footage and not recoverable. So I like to be a little bit more conservative when it comes to exposure when I film, because I really want to make sure that I don't clip any highlights. But luckily we have a few helpers in the camera's menu that allow us to make sure that we don't overexpose our footage. The first one I would turn on is the zebras. These are basically black and white lines that show us any areas that are overexposed. And we can also set up in the settings how aggressive we want these zebras to show up. And I usually set it to around 100 or 105, and that gives me a warning just before I start clipping any highlights. If you set it too conservatively, you basically have zebras in your picture all the time, and then they can become quite distracting. So I usually like to set them to the point just before I would blow out the highlights, so I can make sure that I don't clip those, but at the same time I don't have the zebras showing up too much. Another feature I would always have activated is the histogram. I like it in the viewfinder and also on the back of the camera, because this also shows us where the light is sort of distributed in our image, and we can make sure that we don't clip anything on the right hand side and leave a little bit of a gap there, allowing us to maintain all the highlights in the footage. Some cameras have also things like waveforms or false color, but I think in the beginning, especially, using the zebras and the histogram should be enough for now. If we intend to do a lot of manual focusing, we also have another helper called focus peaking. And this basically overlays a color over all the areas that are in focus, showing us where we're focusing and what is actually in focus. Most of the time I don't manual focus when I do videos, so I usually leave it off. But other times when I do manual focus, it can definitely be helpful. If you know that you're going to do a lot of video or work close to the ground a lot of times, what can also be helpful is that you look at getting one of these monitors that you can put on top of your camera, showing you what you're doing and also making it easier to sort of follow an animal in the field, especially if you're working from a tripod or somewhere where you can't really put your head to the viewfinder, or if you want to leave your hands off from the camera as well, for instance. And oftentimes it's actually hard to see what's happening on the small screen on the back of the camera, so having a nice bigger screen on top of the camera can definitely help. And if you use something like an Atomos Ninja 5, for instance, you can even record onto that screen as well. So having one of these screens is definitely not a must, especially if you don't know how much you like filming, but if you get more into filming, it can definitely be helpful to have and makes it much easier to see what you're doing in certain situations. And if you're a photographer like me that likes to shoot photo and video, I would highly recommend that you check out my masterclass, my pro sets, and my brush pack, because becoming a skilled editor will help you to get the best results from your photos. So in my masterclass, I teach you step by step everything you need to know in Photoshop to get amazing results. With my pro sets, I allow you with just one click to transform your raw files. And with my brush pack, I make layer masking in Photoshop so much easier for you. So if these are of interest to you, make sure to check these out down there in the description. We now have to decide what we actually do in the field and what settings we dial into the camera to get the best footage. And the first thing I always like to do is set my camera to full manual mode, because that gives me the most control over the exposure. What I find quite annoying, especially when it comes to editing, is if I'm using the camera in a more automatic mode and it constantly shifts the exposure because it might get a little bit brighter or a little bit darker. That makes it oftentimes not as nice to edit the footage, because some of your edits might apply to the darker moment, but then if the camera suddenly brightens the exposure, your whole editing doesn't work anymore in that bit, and you kind of have to start chopping and changing, and it doesn't really work out quite well. So shooting full manual mode definitely helps in preventing the camera from changing the exposure when I don't want to, but at the same time it would make it a lot more tricky if you're working in like ever sort of changing light. So in certain situations it can make sense, for instance, to use manual mode with auto ISO and let the camera decide, but most of the time, especially if I'm shooting in more constant conditions like in here today, I will always go to full manual mode, because I want to avoid that suddenly the camera thinks my face got a bit brighter or darker and then changes the exposure and basically ruins the whole clip. So if I'm outside walking through a forest and there's bright sun and dark spots and I'm filming myself, I might be tempted to set up manual mode with auto ISO so the camera can brighten my face if I'm in a darker area and darken my face when I'm in a brighter area. But in most other situations, I like to stick to full manual mode. And I know full manual mode always sounds very scary, but if you have zebras activated and the histogram in your viewfinder, it's basically impossible to fail at it. So now that we're in manual mode, we have to set up 3 inputs: the shutter speed, the aperture, and the ISO. The shutter speed is one input that can heavily influence how we perceive the videos and how much motion blur we actually see between the video frames. In this video that I'm filming at 25 frames per second and a 50th of a second as my shutter speed, you will notice if I wave my hand, there's a bit of motion blur between the single frames, and it just looks like what our eyes would see as well. Whereas if I was using a much too high shutter speed, I would end up in a situation where it looks really choppy, because now my hand is just moving too fast and there's no motion blur anymore. So you might wonder what actually is the right shutter speed, so I get a bit of motion blur but not too much, and also not have too high shutter speed where the video looks choppy. And luckily we have something called the 180-degree rule, and that says that our shutter speed should be double our frame rate. So at 25 frames per second we should have a 50th of a second as our shutter speed, and at 120 frames per second we should have a 2/50th as our shutter speed. So basically the shutter speed should always be double our frame rate. Now that sounds really easy, and it's not too much of a problem if you're filming inside like I do, or if you're filming outside on a cloudy day. But it can become a big issue if you're outside and it's nice and bright, because then it will be almost impossible to have a slow enough shutter speed without blowing out your video. So on a bright day where we are already using one of our lowest possible ISOs, we basically have 3 options. We can use an ND filter, we can use a too high shutter speed, or we can stop down our lens a lot. And none of these 3 is a perfect solution. An ND filter is basically like sunglasses for your camera. So it's a dark piece of glass that you either mount on front of your lens or in the back of your lens if you use one of the big telephoto lenses. And it darkens down your lens, basically letting less light onto your sensor, allowing you to use lower shutter speeds. The biggest downside with an ND filter is that you always have to take it on and off. And if you're like me and like to shoot photo and video in short succession in the field, an ND filter is also not very practical, because I need it for the video clips, but then I don't want it on if I take photos because it slows down my shutter speed too much for the photos. So if I know I will only do filming, I will definitely put an ND filter on my lens. But if I have just one lens, one camera, and I want to take photos and videos, an ND filter is not my main go-to choice. So that leaves me with two options, either to use a too high shutter speed or stop down my lens a lot. On a bright day, probably to like f20 or something like that. And in the past, I've done that. But what I don't like about it is if you stop down your lens too much, first of all, you lose a little bit of sharpness. And secondly, basically your whole background becomes in focus. Sometimes that can work quite well and I do it, but most of the time it actually looks quite strange. And it's not the kind of video look I'm going for. I like to have a much shallower depth of field in my videos because to me it looks much more smooth and much more cinematic rather than having a camera that's similar to what your phone captures, for instance, where almost everything is in focus. So on a bright day, if I don't want to use an ND filter and don't want to stop down my aperture, I have to use a too high shutter speed. And this is sometimes what I do. If I know I have just one camera, one lens, and I want to switch between photo and video, I'm willing to sacrifice on the shutter speed side of things. For humans, I don't like to do this because we're quite used to that motion blur in humans that we see day to day with our own eyes. But with birds, I feel like we can get away with it a lot more easy. And here we have a clip of crested pigeons where you can see that the clip on the left has a shutter speed of a 400th of a second. And the clip on the right has a slower shutter speed. And you can see that the pigeon on the left looks a little bit more choppy. But overall, I feel like that the difference isn't that dramatic that it stops me from sometimes using the too high shutter speed. One area where I will use a too high shutter speed intentionally is if I know I'm filming birds in flight or fast action. Because in these moments, we want to have fast enough shutter speeds to actually sort of freeze that action and not have too much motion blur. If you, for instance, try to film birds in flight at 25 frames a second at a 50th of a second, you're only seeing like a blurry mess. So usually when I film birds in flight, I use a higher frame rate and I also use a higher shutter speed, allowing me to freeze the wings enough so I don't have crazy motion blur in the bird's wings. We already talked about the aperture. I basically like to keep it as wide open as possible, but also to help me have a slower shutter speed, I sometimes stop down, but I don't like stopping down too far because then I get too much of my background in focus. So normally I shoot anywhere between like f4 and f8 if I can get away with it, if it has a nice distant background, for instance. When it comes to the ISO, it's actually pretty simple. We want to use the lowest ISO possible. But we have to make one important distinction, that is whether we shoot in the standard profile or in log. If we're shooting in log, our base ISO is usually 800 and some cameras also have a second base ISO of like 3200. You can't really shoot at lower ISOs in log unless you're willing to sacrifice dynamic range, but that's not really what we want to do when we're shooting in log. So on most cameras, log is ISO 800 as your base ISO, and that can definitely make it tricky on those bright days. In a standard profile, you just have your normal ISO range available, and I would recommend to go as low as possible, ISO 100 for instance, and increase it when it gets darker. So I'm sure by now you've definitely noticed that the brighter it gets, the more difficult it becomes to film. If you're shooting inside or on a nice overcast day on a darker forest, filming is beautiful and everything is great. But if you're outside in the bright sun, filming can actually become a lot more difficult, and you will either have to use ND filters or be willing to sacrifice on how your video looks by using a higher shutter speed or stop down your lenses a bit more. Focusing is something that used to be quite difficult when it comes to video work, but it has become a lot easier with the latest mirrorless cameras like a Nikon Z8, Canon R5 or Sony A9 Mark III. These cameras have fantastic eye-tracking autofocus also in video mode available and allow you to basically point your camera onto the subject and it will find the subject and then track it all over the viewfinder. So that has made our life much easier. In the past, my go-to trick for autofocusing was not to use the eye tracking, but to rather use like a small zone or an autofocusing point, and then not even try to focus on the subject, but focus on the perch that the subject is sitting on, for instance. Because those older autofocusing systems were so unreliable that they would often jump off your subject. Whereas if I'm focusing on the ground in front of the subject or right where the subject is or on the perch, and the subject moves, my autofocus will still stay on the perch and my subject will still stay in focus. Whereas if I focus on the subject's head, for instance, and it turns around, oftentimes then the autofocus would jump onto the background. With the newer cameras, this doesn't happen anymore and I use the eye tracking, but if you use like an older DSLR camera, for instance, using a smaller zone and then just focusing on something steady that's right next to your subject that still keeps your subject in focus is a better idea than trying to directly focus on your subject. So when it comes to setting up the actual autofocus, I like to set it to continuous tracking or AFF when I'm using Nikon. And then I also select animal subject detection. So the camera will find my subject all over the viewfinder, focus on it, stare on it, and then track it even if it's walking through my frame or moving on a branch, for instance. And with the newer cameras, this has become very good and they track your subject very reliable. One area that can sometimes be difficult because video autofocus is usually slower than stills autofocus is to actually get your camera to find your subject in the viewfinder, especially if it's completely out of focus. What I would do in these cases is actually go to stills mode, focus on my subject, and then quickly switch back to video. And then in video mode, the subject will also be right there and sharp in your viewfinder. And that usually is the fastest way of actually finding your bird in that certain area. The other option is to just simply film all in manual mode, but I find that very difficult. With focus peaking on, it's definitely doable, but I prefer the autofocus these days, and in some of the mirrorless cameras, it's so good that it's also much faster than manual focus now. With certain older cameras or certain video cameras like from the Canon Cinema series, you will likely have to do a lot more manual focusing, but if I can, I will avoid it. The other reason I like to avoid manual focusing is as well that I always have to have my hands on the camera. And if I film and it's possible, I like to take my hands off the camera to introduce as little shake as possible. So if you're constantly holding your camera and turning that manual focusing, you will introduce a lot more shake unless you have a very heavy video tripod with a very heavy video head. What has been truly amazing for photographers and videographers like me is the availability of the image stabilization and the new IBIS in certain cameras. That actually makes it possible to handhold video and film handheld while you're in the field. And this is one area where shooting in slow motion can also help, because if you're shooting in slow motion, you won't see all the shaking that you're doing. Whereas if you do handheld video at normal speed, you have to be very sturdy, have a good position with like your elbow in your chest and your camera pressed against your face to be able to not have too much shake in your videos. There's good stabilizing software available as well, but if I can, I want to have my footage as stable as possible in the field. When it comes to using long lenses in handheld video, Nikon is definitely the brand that has the biggest advantage there, because there I can use like a 600mm PF lens, a 2x extender, and still get relatively shake-free video, which is unheard of with most other brands. On Canon, if you have like an R3 and a 100 to 500mm lens, it's also very stable, but Nikon is still a little bit better, and it's truly impressive using it in the field. And it actually gives me a lot of freedom as a photographer, because I can just grab like a Z8 and a 600mm PF lens, walk around, take some photos, and whenever I see a video opportunity, I can simply switch to video and start filming and still get really nice and stable footage. A lot of cameras also offer us the option to have active image stabilization in the camera, which is basically the camera trying to balance out your movements. That can work, but sometimes it looks a little bit sort of robotic and the image moves a bit funny. And at the same time, you're also applying a crop to the image then, depending on how aggressive you have that sort of active image stabilization within the camera. So normally I would opt to not have any active image stabilization or digital image stabilization activated in camera, because it crops in and doesn't always look quite natural. I rather like to either rely on a stable handheld technique with a good lens and a good camera, or use a tripod to get the most shake-free footage. If you're using wide-angle lenses, this experience may be quite different, but for long telephoto lenses, I've found that using either the tripod or good image stabilization and good handheld technique gives me the best results, and the active image stabilization just simply looks a bit strange sometimes. Talking about the tripod, this is obviously the best way to do filming. And if you can, I would always recommend to film from a tripod. Handheld video is possible these days, especially if you're shooting Nikon, but at the same time, video from a tripod, especially heavy tripod with a video head, is always the number one choice. But at the same time, a big tripod and a big heavy video head can also slow you down a fair bit in the field. So my setup at the moment, if I want to take photos and videos, is a really right stuff tripod with a Flex Shooter Pro tripod head, which is nice and stable and allows me to do video if I know that I also want to take photos. If I only want to do video, then I will opt for a big heavy tripod with a big heavy tripod head. But in most situations, I want to do photo and video, and then I look for sort of a lightweight compromise. One thing I like to do as well if I know that I want to shoot in different camera modes, and that is to set up custom functions that, for instance, have one setting for high frame rates, one setting for low frame rates. So on my R5, for instance, I can have different custom functions for video. And if I want to go to 120 frames per second, I'd simply go from custom function 1 to custom function 2. So custom function 1 might be 4K 25 frames per second and a 50th of a second. And custom function 2 will be 4K 120 frames per second and a 2/50th of a second as my shutter speed. And that allows me to quickly change between the different modes. And there's certain cameras where you can't do this, where you always have to go into the menu to change your video settings. And that can be quite annoying if you quickly want to change between the different modes in the field. And lastly, if we're filming a lot, we also have to be conscious that our cameras are not overheating, and we'll also run through a lot of batteries if we're doing a lot of filming. So there's nothing we can really do about overheating, but I would recommend that you go into your camera's menu and set the overheating threshold to high. That should limit a lot of the overheating warnings. And otherwise, we just simply have to take a break or not have our camera in standby all the time if we're not filming. Now, if you're in a colder climate, overheating is not a problem at all, but here in Queensland where it's hot and humid sometimes, overheating can definitely be an issue, especially if you use like a camera like the original R5. If I leave that on for 20-30 minutes, do some filming, I often run into some issues if I'm shooting in the oversampled 4K or in 4K 120 frames per second, for instance. So in these cases, I sometimes have a second R5 with me and I just switch the two bodies, or I'll sometimes turn the camera off, and I also make sure that the screen is out so there's as much heat as possible being able to kind of dissipate from the body. And when it comes to the batteries, you definitely have to take a handful of batteries with you, because if you're doing a lot of filming, your camera will chew through a lot of batteries quite quickly as well. So a handful of batteries and good heat management, or trying to keep your camera in the shade a little bit or not have it on if you know that you're not doing any filming, will definitely help you to get some beautiful footage in the field. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this video. I hope I could give you some insights into video on how to set up your camera. And if you get some good results or if it has helped you, please make sure to let me know in the comments. Check out my channel membership, give me a thumbs up for the video and hit that subscribe button. And I will see you in another video very soon. Bye guys.